Hi, and welcome to this edition of the Our Catholic Prayers podcast. I'm Christopher Castagnoli for OurCatholicPrayers.com. In these troubled, confused times, I'd like to start off with a prayer relating to our subject matter for this podcast, 2 Thomases and Our Times. One of these Thomases is one of the Church's most preeminent theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas. The other is the Thomas Register, or thomasnet.com as it's known on the Internet. Many of those seeking a way out of our current troubles would be wise to keep these 2 in mind somehow. How does this relate to the prayer I'm about to recite? Stay tuned. First, here's the prayer. Dear Lord, help us all to resist the siren songs coming from those who speak of a false security and a peace that does not come from you. In these troubled times, it is all too easy to see the common good as something we can achieve without you. Yet time and time again in history, this has proven to be a tragically mistaken notion. Now more than ever, help us all to see that your will must be done in all things, not that of some supposed committee of experts who ignore you and wish to make themselves gods, but are merely fallible, corruptible human beings. Amen. Getting back to the Thomases. I mentioned Aquinas because of his voluminous writings on our fallen nature, and on how much our Creator offers us ways to share his justice, peace, and love. Aquinas' monumental work, the Summa Theologica, covers quite thoroughly in some 3,000 articles spanning 5 volumes what author Kevin Vost refers to as faith, morals, the nature of God, and the nature of human experience, with insights to help us best reflect God's grace. I'd like to recommend here Mr. Vost's book, The 1 Minute Aquinas, which I will link to on the description page for this podcast, for a wonderfully accessible overview of St. Thomas's teachings. While our Lord doesn't offer us heaven on this earth, he has given us a way to achieve a more harmonious existence through prayer, his commandments, and his church with its sacraments. He seeks to strengthen us in our good intentions through prayer and communion, and to help us with our sinful proclivities in confession and in examining our consciences regularly, and by bringing out in us true humility and respect for others. And while we see Catholicism weakened from scandal and theological tepidity these days, Christ did promise us that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. This is taken from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, verse 18. Thomas's Register is a different kind of voluminous work. Years ago, I would search its many pages when looking for products for my business. As mentioned earlier, it is now available on the Internet and still contains listings for many industrial companies and suppliers. The fundamental point and linkage between these 2 is that we need to have a free market, not one that is somehow state-controlled, for businesses to flourish that can address people's needs for goods and services, and also to give them the means to use their own God-given talents and abilities in serving others as well. However, the marketplace needs people who have a godly moral foundation to work properly and fairly, and with justice. Speaking of suppliers, as I did a moment ago, Leonard Read, in a 1958 essay called I Pencil, lauded by the famous economist Milton Friedman, showed the impressive network of interdependent businesses and people with their different types of expertise that go into making that little writing implement that we all use. I will link to this essay in the description page for this podcast. And that very interdependence is what God the Father told the 14th century mystic St. Catherine of Siena that he desired from us, and why he gave people different levels of talents and skills in different areas. As he expressed it in private revelations he gave to her, recorded in a book still in print called The Dialogue. I could easily have created men possessed of all that they should need, both for body and soul. But I wish that one should have need of the other, and that they should be my ministers to administer the graces and the gifts that they have received from me. Keeping in mind God the Father's words, when so many of our elites favor a concentration of economic as well as political power, what central planning board could bring together so many people of diverse skills and backgrounds to make not just our pencils, but just about everything we use? How could any such entity possibly foresee all human ingenuity and potential? Sadly, many people today are thinking only of tearing down the supposedly oppressive order we're under now, so that somehow utopia will emerge, like the phoenix bird rising from the ashes. Too many of our intelligentsia and various cultural elites, bored, perhaps understandably, by the many arcane details involved in the production of goods and services, think much like Vladimir Lenin that everything just gets done somehow. When he launched the tragic Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, he envisioned a state that would become one office and one factory with equal work and equal pay, as he wrote that year. Yet in such a state that controls the means of production, loyalty to the ruling party winds up trumping actual expertise. Considerations of supply and demand for what is actually needed are shunted aside in favor of pre-planned quotas decided upon by some central committee or other such planning board. As a result, people wind up experiencing shortages not of just what might be considered luxuries, but necessities as well. This doesn't apply to those running the show, of course. They get the very special privileges often railed against by propagandists everywhere. There is a popular expression, think globally, act locally. While we hear the first part constantly these days, the second part, acting locally, is now more important than ever. Globalists often talk a good game of the interdependence of nations in acknowledging the need for all of us to work together in combating the world's ills. But the question becomes, how much authority are we giving, and to whom, to solve these problems? There is a Catholic principle known as subsidiarity that can reinforce this interdependence God the Father spoke of in a good way. This fancy term means, according to Catholic Answers, that, as they put it on one of their pages on the internet, matters ought to be handled by the smallest, lowest, or least centralized competent authority, rather than a higher and more distant one, whenever possible. In other words, smaller is better in many situations. Those closest to a particular need are often more able to fulfill it properly and advance human dignity in the process. Or, as author Trent Horn put it in a great new book entitled Can a Catholic Be a Socialist?, that I will also link to on this podcast's description page. His answer is no, by the way. Subsidiarity is the belief that a more central authority should subside or sit back and intervene only when lower local authorities cannot address a problem. Horn quotes from the encyclical Quadragesimo Anno from Pope Pius XI in 1931, where the Holy Father wrote as follows: As history abundantly proves, it is true that on account of changed conditions, many things which were done by small associations in former times cannot be done now save by large associations. Still, just as it is gravely wrong to take from individuals what they can accomplish by their own initiative and industry and give it to the community, so also it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. For every social activity ought of its very nature to furnish help to the members of the body social and never destroy and absorb them. This is taken from paragraph 79 of that encyclical. And as Pope Benedict XVI said in his 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate, in order not to produce a dangerous universal power of a tyrannical nature, the governance of globalization must be marked by subsidiarity, articulated into several layers and involving different levels that can work together. Globalization certainly requires authority, insofar as it poses the problem of a global common good that needs to be pursued. This authority, however, must be organized in a subsidiary and stratified way if it is not to infringe upon freedom. This is taken from paragraph 57 of that encyclical. It is worth noting here that Lenin, like the communist regime he set up, saw God and religion itself as grave impediments to the true justice that only a Marxist-minded, militantly atheistic state could bring about, one in which any notion of subsidiarity was hardly considered, if it was considered at all. Yet when the state replaces God as the focus of worship, there is great dysfunction at best, and much misery and loss of life at worst, as we see from looking at Russia, China, and Cuba, for more prominent examples from the last century. However, the big caveat here, as mentioned before, is that the free market, what many refer to simply as capitalism, needs a moral society to work properly. Dare I say, one governed by traditional Catholic morality. It is not enough just to rail against socialism for its many failures and assaults on our God-given free will. As a reminder, turning to God for His help, guidance, and grace is essential for all involved, no matter how small or large a particular task at hand might be. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in the Summa Theologica of what he called the 5 effects of grace in us. One of these, the first, is to heal the soul. The second, for us to desire good. The third, to carry into effect the good proposed. The fourth, to persevere in good. And the fifth, to reach glory with God. As a reference point, this is taken from the first part of the second part of the Summa, question 111, article 3. Many of our supposed elites now strive to set up a one-world government, ostensibly to create a better, more just world, with God taking a back seat, if He is thought of at all. Yet we must remember as Catholics and Christians what Jesus said: I am the vine and you are the branches. and without me you can do nothing. This is taken from John's Gospel, chapter 15, verse 5. And then there's this inspiring directive found in Psalm 127 as well. Unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Unless the Lord keep the city, he watcheth in vain that keepeth it. This is taken from Psalm 127, verse 1. Remember as well that the more we empower some corporate socialist technocratic mixture of big corporations, big technology, and a resulting big bureaucracy, particularly in this pandemic age, supposedly on our behalf, the less power we'll wind up actually having. And such entities often wind up increasing poverty overall rather than alleviating it, although they might provide some needed short-term relief for the many needy among us for a time. This also ties in with a deceptively alluring notion that mankind can bring about a truly just and peaceful world, a veritable heaven on earth, without any help from God. Needless to say, efforts in this regard have been more hellish, starting way back with the French Revolution in 1789, which was supposed to somehow exalt reason over religion, in the name of a utopian-sounding brotherhood of man, but ended up creating much chaos and bloodshed instead. And it has been estimated that over 100 million people perished under communism in the last century. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano summed up both the problem and the solution in an interview with LifeSite News when he said, "There cannot be brotherhood among men if it excludes the common fatherhood of the one true God, one and triune." Going back to my focus on subsidiarity, I do not mean to say that all big companies or other such entities are necessarily bad. However, particularly in socialist societies or those run by state or crony capitalism, they are less willing and able to actually respond to and fulfill people's needs. And however democratic a socialist system may start out being, it can easily become more and more authoritarian and even totalitarian as those running it become increasingly involved in maintaining and even expanding their power. They become more and more likely as well to censor any information that goes against their particular narrative. Truth is hidden or smothered, and mistakes never get corrected, nor corruption brought to light. In this day and age, when electronic monitoring is becoming more and more intrusive, such as in the social credit scores in China that dictate where one can work, shop, and travel, we face increasingly difficult times both for Catholicism and for society at large, and of course for freedom as well. We could all find ourselves soon living in a world where much of our God-given dignity and power to run our lives has been taken away in the name of some sort of top-down government structure. This state might promise and even provide some sort of sustenance, but it will still control us and surveil all our activities in a manner the likes of which the KGB and Gestapo could only dream of, especially in our increasingly cashless societies. Run afoul of the authorities? They will soon be able to leave you without food, employment, or shelter with a few keystrokes, so that some mandatory ID card or, heaven forbid, some implanted chip no longer works, for example. While the free market or capitalism indeed is capable of unjust excesses. It provides the best way to meet people's needs and even to fulfill their dreams. When actively joined with Christianity, it can be a force for good, allowing people of differing strengths and talents to create and share an increasingly abundant pool of resources for the betterment of society and lifting up more of the world's poor out of poverty. Which, again, is not meant to take all private enterprise off the hook by any means. From the big multinationals to the small slumlords, those running things who are only interested in more and more money and power wind up ruining countless lives, and not coincidentally, imperiling their own souls. With no supernatural faith, or just a superficial one at best, they risk winding up like the rich man in our Lord's parable, who finds himself condemned to hell for neglecting the needs of a beggar at his gate, as we read about in Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. Or the rich fool, when God foils his plans to eat, drink, and be merry in his love affair with Mammon, as we read about in Luke's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. No purely human system can ever work the way our Creator wishes it to advance human dignity. Sooner or later, greed and selfishness take over if the people running things think of themselves as gods rather than as God's children. Corruption and incompetence at meeting people's needs becomes the order of the day. The famous 19th century patron saint of parish priests, the curé of Ars, Jean-Marie Vianney, referred to the larcenous spirit that infects so many of us in various enterprises, both large and small, when he said in a sermon to his mostly agrarian flock in that small town, Ars, in France. My dear brethren, the most common thefts are those committed in the course of buying and selling. Let us examine this more closely, so that you may recognize the wrong that you do, and at the same time, see how you can set about correcting it. You will take the precaution of putting the smallest and the poorest specimens of a crop in the midst of the bunch. You will say, "But if I didn't do that, I wouldn't sell so much." To put it another way, if you conducted yourself like a good Christian, you would not rob as you do. You have mixed your wine with another of poorer quality, yet you sell it as a good and unadulterated wine. If people show signs of not believing you, you will swear that it is good, and it is not once but 20 times that you thus give your soul over to the devil. Ah, my children, there is no need for you to be over-anxious to give yourselves to him. You have been his for a long time now. I do the same as everyone else. So much the worse for anyone who is taken in. I have been cheated. I try to cheat in my own turn. Otherwise, I would lose too much. Is it, my children, that if others are damning themselves, then you must need damn yourselves also? They are going to hell. Must you then go along with them? You would prefer to have a few extra pennies and go to hell for all eternity? Ah, if you were in our place, you would do the very same as we do. Yes, my dear children, without any doubt I would do the very same as you do, if, as you do, I wanted to be damned. But since I want to be saved, I would do the exact opposite of what you do. This is not meant to be a knock against private property per se. Joseph of Arimathea was able to provide a clean tomb for Jesus' wonderfully short-lived stay there after all. It's all about understanding our appetites and how easily they can make us slaves to sinful impulses if we don't follow God's desires for us to use our talents and abilities, whatever they may be, to help each other for our good and His glory. There is a seductively dangerous notion that somehow, if we just nationalize business or otherwise put it firmly under the thumb of government control, that utopia will somehow emerge. But you cannot nationalize virtue. Virtue has to come from the graces God gives us in prayer and in His sacraments. And it must be tended to and nurtured like a very special plant. Each of our souls needs to be swept clean of the dust and grime of concupiscence and attraction to sin that builds up in them every day. Prayer and the sacramental life can also help tamp down the greedy parts of our nature in reminding us that we are not the sum of our possessions, or that he or she who dies with the most toys does not win. In fact, when looking at our existence as an earthly pilgrimage towards our afterlife, God willing, in heaven, we see from a scriptural perspective alone how much excess wealth can be an impediment to our salvation. Those greedy Gordon Gekko types from the movie Wall Street, for whom too much is not enough and think only of their bank accounts rather than the common good, indeed abuse the marketplace and give capitalism a bad name. They themselves may very well find they have lost their souls someday, winding up like the rich man in hell in the parable I mentioned earlier. They clearly lack both temperance and prudence, two of the four cardinal virtues, which are essential components of that other one we all crave, or at least in the case of many virtue signalers nowadays, that we claim to crave. That is, justice. We've seen time and time again, without God calling the shots, how easily unjust people's ideas of justice can be, particularly when they are based solely on the power of those defining them. Without God's grace, which St. Thomas rightly called nothing short of partaking of the divine nature, those in charge, filled with arrogance, often ignore the people they claim to serve or give them solutions to their problems that don't work, as they try to do more than they can properly handle. This can be especially true in planned or otherwise heavily bureaucratic economies. It is indeed true that planning itself is by no means wrong or evil. In fact, many companies have run afoul of the needs of their customers by concentrating only on short-term profit at the expense of longer-term concerns of what is actually best for their companies. But when fulfilling a plan, like some predetermined quota, becomes paramount over all concerns as to whether it is working or not, or is just meant to serve one person, such as a Mao or a Stalin, or a small group of elites, the results can be disastrous. It is worth noting here that both Mao and Stalin precipitated horrible famines in their countries. Stalin, with the people of Ukraine in the 1930s, when he savagely requisitioned all their food in punishment over policy disputes. And Mao, with his great leap forward, as he called it, from 1958 to 1962, which forced people into supposedly self-sufficient but failing communities that led to mass starvation. Over 4 million people perished in Ukraine, and anywhere between 15 and 45 million in China. On a less dramatic note, think about how much money local, state, and federal governments ask of us in taxes. How much of that money goes down a rabbit hole of waste, fraud, and abuse, bribery, and excessive bureaucracy? And have you noticed, in the midst of so many social programs available supposedly to help lift the poor out of poverty, how many people were still stuck in some kind of subsidized misery even before this pandemic hit? And how the problem is always framed when programs don't work, not about how to make them more functional, but rather on how they're always short on funds. We've all seen examples as well of municipalities doubling down on what doesn't work, either from lack of ingenuity on the part of those running things, or because of too much red tape getting in the way. Also keep in mind all the rationing of food, goods, and most tellingly, and in some cases quite tragically, medical care that becomes quite commonplace in far-left governments. When everything is free, you tend to get what you pay for, and you yourself become less and less free, and more a ward of the state. I realize, nonetheless, that it is important to take into account in this time of great economic uncertainty and massive debt that people everywhere are looking to government for much needed assistance. But as much as we can, bringing in Catholic teaching such as that I have been discussing here about subsidiarity and God-given virtue becomes more, not less essential as we move, hopefully, into a post-pandemic paradigm. In summary, the takeaway here, coming back to our two Thomases, is that we need to keep in mind our Lord's gospel message as reflected in St. Thomas's wonderful compendia of church teachings, and that true interdependence comes from societies in which people are free to share their time, talents, and labor in a myriad of specialties and interests, reflecting their God-given abilities, free from the constraints found in top-down command and control regimes. St. Thomas Aquinas reminds us of the importance of genuine virtue, and the Thomas's Register, which focuses mainly but not exclusively on industrial needs, reminds us of the great variety of goods and services that a free market can provide to keep things running smoothly. It can only keep doing so, however, in a society imbued with the proper Christian spirit and a genuine love of God and neighbor. Thanks for listening. I'm Christopher Castagnoli for OurCatholicPrayers.com. Please feel free to share this podcast. And if you're listening to it on YouTube or some other host that allows you to subscribe to podcasts, we'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to the Our Catholic Prayers podcast channel. Until next time, God bless.